Kia ora, and welcome to this Monday evening's viewing with us on the network.
One Turns 40 is proudly brought to you by the listener.
My first memories of TV are waiting for it to arrive in New Zealand, and Michael, my brother, saying to me, "Stan Dallas, the radio doctor's got TV in the shop." And we ran all the way up Moxham Avenue on a Friday night in the dark and the rain and sat with all the other neighbourhood kids on the floor of Stan Dallas, the radio doctor's shop, and watched some very boring documentary about geese flying.
My best friend was my best friend only because they had a television and I could go and watch Gigantor at his place after school.
10 seconds. Here we go, folks. Make this one a good one.
Today, 24-hour multi-channel TV is something we all take for granted, and local programs are an important part of our viewing. We've created our own style and developed a confidence in our culture, but that's all had to be learnt along the way, because when television began in this country with the channel we now know as TV1, it started with next to nothing.
40 years ago, a switch was flicked in Auckland's Shortland Street. Our first television transmission was underway. The country was bewitched, and life in New Zealand would never be the same again.
The stars of that first official broadcast on Wednesday, June the 1st, 1960, were the Howard Morrison Quartet.
It was a night to remember. Anticipation, the sense of pioneering something, breaking trails, all of that, and very, very excited about being part of the first night on television. That's something that we all felt the sense of occasion. And 40 years down the track now, God, the Prime Minister was only 10 then.
That first evening's program was 3 hours long, and technician Steve Henderson acted as floor manager.
I think people were generally keyed up. It was the first night that we'd been live with a live program. It was a real program transmission. Up to that time we had put out experimental transmissions which didn't include any real entertainment material.
Everything went smoothly, but there'd been plenty of preparation. Planning for TV had started more than a decade earlier, but successive governments had postponed a final go-ahead. They seemed intimidated by television, and there was concern about the cost.
TV is just a waste of money. You don't know what you're missing.
Television, television, I'm sick of looking on television.
Television came as a great surprise to the Broadcasting Administration because Walter Nash announced in Britain that they were going to start a service in New Zealand, and he hadn't remembered to mention it to anybody back home.
Television had arrived, in Auckland anyway. Wellington and Christchurch waited another year, and Dunedin didn't see its first pictures until 1962. In the beginning, official transmission was limited to one night a week.
Yes, only Wednesday night initially. On Monday night it was called Experimental, and they used to play extraordinarily boring documentaries called Smoke Abatement in Manchester, you know, the things that were provided for free by oil companies and the British Ministry of Information, that kind of thing. People watched anything. Once we decided that if we filmed someone digging a hole in Shortland Street outside the studios, they'd watch that. So we filmed a little bit of that and put it into the news. There was no comment from anyone.
The government had agreed to introduce television, but it wasn't quite so keen about paying for it. A £10 licence fee was quickly introduced, and commercials soon followed. But a local news service would take longer. Early bulletins were cobbled together from foreign film clips.
From points north, east, west and south, we present Television Newsreel.
We used to get little parcels of film from overseas every day and put them together in a little room down in the basement of the building in Shortland Street. And I used to write the script, and the film was transmitted silent, and an announcer sitting in the studio would have a script, no monitor, and the news in front of him, and he would read the script to the picture. They didn't always go very happily together.
Meanwhile, continuity announcers became some of our first familiar TV faces.
I can remember my very first continuity coming up and thinking, what am I doing here? Why am I putting myself through this? And realising as the clock ticked around that it was too late. You can't go anywhere, you have to stay here and do what you're going to do. So I did it.
I was asked to come in and audition to be a continuity weather girl. And I'd found a little bit out about Mr. Speed, and I knew he liked fly fishing, and I knew a bit about fly fishing, especially around the Mataura River. And I walked in and shook this hand of this imposing gentleman and said, I believe you do a spot of fly fishing, Mr. Speed. Have you been on that little bend by Gore, you know, just at the back 2K? And he talked for 45 minutes. I never said a word. I never saw a TV camera, a light, no nothing, no studio. And at the end, he shook my hand and said, thank you very much, we'll let you know. And he phoned me the next day and said, you're on tomorrow night. Friday night, I turned up, had the makeup put on, sat down in the chair. There was the camera, and go. No one in the room, and it was just a memory thing, what you said as continuity girls in those days.
How nervous were you?
Nervous. I couldn't get up off the chair. They actually physically took me from my chair and put me into the cab. I couldn't walk. I had wonderful presents from here up, and I could smile sweetly, but I couldn't talk. I couldn't walk at the end of that night. And George phoned the next day and said, wonderful, would you like a contract? And my TV life began.
Well, a continuity announcer really became the face, I think, for the channel. And so it entailed outlining the programs for the evening, highlighting the programs which were coming up, saying welcome and saying goodnight at the end of the program. And a little later on, we were also asked to do commercial spots. So there may be, I remembered one, a fruit spot. So we would say, the time is 8 o'clock, time for a banana. Which seems a bit odd now, doesn't it?
Television, television. I'm sick of it. Television, television. Hey, Mr. General Public, do you realize that we got a generation here of staring eyes?
There was no problem with women being continuity announcers, but behind the cameras it was a different matter. Pioneering documentary maker Shirley Maddock had been working as a producer for several years before she was allowed the title, and even then she still had problems.
In Wellington, when I was making a film about the centenary of Parliament shifting from Auckland to Wellington, it turned out that when I went down on the floor of the house, I had a crew from the National Film Unit this time, an usher came up and said, women aren't allowed on the floor of the house, only women members. And the other people who were forbidden were convicted felons, drunkards, and lunatics. And I had to direct my camera from the press gallery.
Owning a TV in the early 60s wasn't cheap. Prices started at £120, at a time when the take-home pay for a factory worker was £17 a week. Despite the expense, 300,000 licences had been issued by 1965. There was one channel, and we all joined together to watch the same programmes.
Everyone was glued to the Avengers. And it was said, and with some truth, that if the Avengers was on, you couldn't get a taxi, because the guys were all in there watching it. If you had a meeting, the television set was... this is absolutely true. The television set would be wheeled in and the meeting stopped because everyone watched the Avengers.
Everyone had their favourite overseas shows, but local broadcasters were eagerly learning how to make their own programmes. After the break, the emergence of local shows and our own stars.
I can remember, I think television came to Dunedin about 62. I would have been about 12 years old. Yeah, I remember going down to the Tudors, who had one of the first TV sets on the street. I think we watched the test pattern for a couple of hours. It was great.
Good evening. Well, I hope you're enjoying your holiday weekend. Let's see what we have on screen for you tonight. In just a moment, it's Country Calendar.
In those days, there would have been half a generation, I suppose. Somewhere in the family would be uncle so-and-so or cousin so-and-so who still was on the land. Holidays were spent on farms and that type of thing. And so there was also that enormous dependency, I suppose, on agriculture. You know, it was always the oft-quoted statement, we bring in 90% of the exports to New Zealand, and so farmers have to be looked after. So automatically we got a television program.
Most countries had an agricultural program, but ours was different. It played in prime time, straight after My Favourite Martian in the early days and the news in later years.
So whilst it was aimed specifically at the agricultural audience, these townies started to watch it, and it just became part of the New Zealand culture. Because you've got to remember that we had about 3 or 4, 5, how many years, I don't know, only a single channel. So it was compulsory viewing. If you wanted your telly on, everybody watched everything in those days. And so everybody watched Country Calendar.
And some other rather interesting talent here too, Godfrey.
Well, it's nice to see you've got 2 sheep in the studio, Fred. Let's have that.
But it was a very different program in those early days. 15 minutes long, a mix of news, studio interviews and film reports. And the pace, well, they say life on the farm is kind of laid back.
But I have to say, in fairness, that if you do look back, as occasionally we need to, look back on those very early country calendars, and oh my heaven, we have changed. We would leave a tractor trundling through shot and not say a word. And they are dreadful, even though I was directing on them at the time. There has been an increase in pace. It's just that relative to the whiz-bang stuff of today, and the special effects. I mean, the nearest we've got to gee whizzy is doing occasional mix between 2 shots. I mean, that's pretty bloody pacey, mate.
Country Calendar has offered its urban audience a view of a life most of them will never know. But the program has also taken advantage of that relationship. With its trademark authority, Country Calendar has produced spoof episodes that have pulled the wool over the viewer's eyes and fooled more than a few people who probably should have known better.
Well, obviously the most famous has been the fence playing. That was lovely.
Okay, that's the basic unit. Think you can handle it now?
Yeah, give it a go anyway.
Just take it slowly.
I think the most successful one would have to be the bionic dog.
And try and aim the aerial at the dog if you can. That's right.
The most telling, I suppose, of how credible those spoofs were, I got in the lift after we'd just finished playing the bionic dog, and the Director General got into the lift with us and said, Frank, I don't know where you find those amazing people, a radio-controlled dog. And I looked at him quizzically and I said, yeah. And I thought, my God, he believed it. And who am I to say, you bloody idiot?
Hello, Josephine. How do you do? Do you remember me, baby? Like I remember you. You used to laugh at me.
In the 60s, pop music conquered the world and its television screens. New Zealand's star maker of the pop shows was Kevin Moore. Moore had been a producer since the early 60s, but in November 66, he unleashed his masterstroke, Come On.
It was a time that the Beatles and the Liverpool sound and the sort of 4-button suits and wrinkle picker shoes and all these things were coming into vogue. It was also a time when barriers were broken socially. Suddenly it was quite acceptable for the BBC, for example, to have regional accents on radio and television, as opposed to the sort of Oxford English type of thing. And that type of movement, of course, was spread through New Zealand, and we were part of that reflection.
Daylight saving time, you're gonna give me more time to have fun with my baby. Oh, daylight saving.
Moore might have been the show's driving force, but in front of the cameras, the face of Come On was Pete Sinclair.
And
time as the sun sets on Come On, let's have a little bit of daylight saving time. Sandy Evans with her new disc, which of course is going to be entered for this year's Golden Disc Award.
He was a very talented guy. Apart from having a very good mind and being able to write words to be spoken well, working with our fast-paced shows and live, he was a 100% insurance policy.
On an earlier show, I told you what psychedelic meant. Maybe you missed the show. Well, tonight we aim to show you exactly what psychedelic means. This is one of the most way-out numbers ever to hit your screen. This one's really in orbit. Mr. Lee Grant and Get Me to the World on time.
Nothing was left to chance. Each episode of Come On was painstakingly rehearsed and then recorded as a live show. When the cameras rolled, there was no room for slip-ups.
It was all mimed, lip-synced. I had to do that perfectly, practice that in front of the mirror. And then you would go right through to dress rehearsal and then live. And so it was a one-take Charlie, and you had to often, you might be waiting, I might be crouching under your chair to run over there and sing because Ray Wolf's just been on before me, or Tommy Adderley, or whatever, Suzanne, or the Chicks, and be ready to jump in repo, and the cameras move, it cuts back to Pete Sinclair, you've got to get into position, on you go. So you had to do, it was really rapid-fire television. It was fantastic.
The boys watch your girls while the girls watch the boys who watch your girls go by. Eye to eye, they solemnly convene to make this scene.
Up until the end of '68, we got away with the slightly risque pop and rock and roll lyrics that were slightly changing. By '69, of course, the lyrics became a lot more drug-oriented after psychedelia and a lot more sexually explicit. It was very hard to actually find good songs to do it every week that would fit into the censorship of 6:30 at night or whatever it was, 6 at night, I think it was. So I think Kevin Moore had a tremendous problem there trying to cope with that.
And on this, our final edition, it's once again our pleasure to premiere another new Mr. Lee Grant disc, which of course...
And so Come On was laid to rest, and a more family-friendly show took its place.
My brief was to produce a middle-of-the-road musical show for early prime time, which would appeal to everyone. And I thought, what is the most cynical thing I can think of? And then I thought, a coffee shop. Coffee shop, that's what we're going to think of. Happen in. Welcome, one and all.
I am a fantasy. Mirror, 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 look at me. Do you believe in what I see? Had my first taste of love.
Happenin' led the way for later music shows like Sing and produced new stars in Angela Ayres, Rob Guest and Craig Scott.
It's black on black at midnight, so your faith must be your guide, light to erase the fear of darkness from your mind. You've got to fade away into tomorrow. You've got to live that...
Happening was different from any previous shows like that. Previous shows were pretty raw, Come On, and programs like that were pretty raw and wild and raunchy. We had this period of time in music and television, which was pretty sweet, saccharine, angelic time. And it was more based at family values, I guess, than scaring the pants off people. Well, that's how it was on TV.
Yeah.
What we did in between the time was different, but that's the way the show was structured, I believe.
The mid-70s brought music videos and new programs. Ready to Roll was the way Saturday night began. And then there was the Grunt Machine.
The Grunt Machine was fun. I was a DJ, and Brian Denane, the producer, came to see me one day and said, I need someone to front it. Would you come and do it? I said, yes. But I tried to do it a bit differently, with the fuzzy hair and the barber's chair and the drinks cabinet around, like Dean Martin sort of thing.
I have ridden through the night to tell you of my love.
Meanwhile, talent contests had been part of our viewing since the start of television. And well into the 70s, Studio One and New Faces were still unearthing the good, the bad and the unfortunate. They covered the musical spectrum, from singing families through to serious rock bands. But the judges also wanted their own share of the attention.
May I interrupt? I'm very disappointed in your second choice song, and I don't think you were happy with it. At your first song, as compared to the Graham Sherlock and the Walker family improving, you didn't, unfortunately.
Where did it go wrong? I'm not worried about the dress. You were obviously worried about it. Your movements didn't match the song, and I thought the song wasn't your bag. Phil?
I wish I hadn't wore a Lurex dress.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That is a hang-up that I have.
We were a bit self-indulgent on that show, and we deserved all the brickbats we got.
Oh, that's honest.
Mm.
It can happen sometimes, though, can't it?
Oh, I got carried away with our own self-importance. And when you know what the responsibility of what we were there for, Phil Warren would be another one who'd tell you that straight off too. He'd admit that.
Our emerging pop stars were enjoying their fame, but they weren't the only ones in the limelight. After the break, a new breed of journalists begin to make headlines of their own.
In this world, Father dear.
For a long time, we never had one news. TV consisted of 4 regions, each with their own bulletins and newsreaders. In 1969, that changed. Television went network.
American tanks and infantry today pushed to their deepest point inside Cambodia since the offensive began last week.
In the days before networking, this country watched everything as a regional group. And so it wasn't just the news, it was Coronation Street. If you lived in Auckland, you saw Coronation Street a week before Wellington, you saw it a week before Dunedin, as the tape was moved around the country. The same applied to news. So if there was a story breaking in Auckland that was filmed, that would be shown on the news in Auckland, and then the film would be copied and distributed to the other centres overnight. So they'd see what Auckland saw the night before. There was never any sort of really genuine shared experience in terms of news. Once we got to a network situation, that changed fundamentally.
But in those pre-network days, extraordinary measures were required to get even the most basic national bulletins to air. For one early system, stories were written in Wellington and rung through to special phones in the other centres, where they were taken down in shorthand, retyped, and finally given to the newsreader. And another telephone, the one on the newsreader's desk, was all too often the centre of attention.
One night, things were going dramatically wrong. You'll remember the telephone. The telephone was a device. The telephone would ring, you picked it up, and you would make soothing noises and, oh yes, and understanding noises, whilst chaos ruled in the control room. And that's all the telephone was for, to give them time to sort out some technical hitch. And I think it went off 5 or 6 times this night. In the end, I just threw my hands up in despair. I said, look, I'm sick of saying sorry. I'm sick of interrupting the bulletin. You can see it's an absolute shambles, and that's all there is to it.
Near Woodville,
Staying calm in front of the cameras while everything fell apart behind the scenes was a lonely business. But like most of our television in the 60s, news was put together with a lot of Kiwi ingenuity and not much else.
When I worked actually on the news, in the production of it, it used to be produced in a building about 1 kilometre away from the actual studios, and at around about, say the news went to about 7, at about 6:30, we'd all leap into a Zephyr, all jam in the newsreader, all jammed in the back, and somebody would drive on round, and there'd be, Dougal would have a whole pile of scripts, and he'd be lifting it and getting out of the car, and stuff would slide into the gutter, and you'd be picking up tonight's news, damp out of the gutter, and all this sort of stuff. It seemed so amateur then, really. Amateur, literally, the news. Wonderful people involved, of course, Dougal and Bill Toft, Philip Sherry, superb newsreaders. But the technology was so thin, You'd be in the studio and people would be sellotaping pictures on the wall so that you get pictures of it. The auto cue thingy underneath was just a strip like a thin roll of toilet paper underneath, and it would quite often snap during the news. And the paper would be flying everywhere, and these skillful people like Philip would have to keep reading as though nothing had happened while they quickly matched it up again.
During secret talks,
It mightn't have been the way they did things at the BBC, but in other areas like style and pronunciation, we still followed Mother England.
in his brief television address, the President gave some of the reasons for accepting the invitation.
And that was as a result, I think, of whether it was a conscious effort on behalf of the NZBC or whether it was something announcers just did because of the announcer training school. It was as a result of emulating the BBC. We thought that the BBC was the be-all and end-all of radio and television, and we should sound like them. Bit of colonial cringe there, I suspect. And you never really get rid of it, Jim. I have heard myself and seen programs in the past, and I look back and I just go, oh, you absolute... Oh.
While we lacked a network for reporting national news, we became very good at covering local stories. In November '65, Wellington developed a regional program, Town and Around. The show was an immediate success and the other centres were quick to follow suit. Over the next 5 years, the various editions of Town and Around became much-loved local institutions.
So it wasn't grand and it wasn't spectacular and didn't say, hey, we now cross by satellite, or we're now linked to wherever. It was, have you seen they're digging up the road again in Willis Street, and here's one motorist who got stuck. So it was nicely low-key, and it could be good-humoured, and it didn't have to take itself too seriously, and we could have a bit of a laugh.
But there's a lot to be said for an afternoon at the tip. Goodbye.
I had to do this item on the introduction of decimal currency.
Don't shed a tear in July next year for cumbersome pounds and pence.
And as I didn't understand it at all, I thought by far the best way to do it was to make a joke about it. And we were up in Napier doing the story, and I opened the camera by saying, I finally found a place on the planet where you can still spend a penny and have a pee. And I put the penny in, and then you heard the appropriate tinkling sound. Well, dear God, that was hell broke loose, This coarse woman, I was suspended for a month, on that one.
April the 10th, 1968, was one of this country's blackest days. But it was also the day that television news came of age. After the inter-island ferry Wahine struck Barrett's Reef in Wellington, news crews worked long hours to capture images of the events that followed. Much of their footage was lost in the appalling conditions, but 10 precious minutes of the disaster were ready to be seen in Wellington that night.
When they abandoned ship, me and my mate said, we'll grab a kid each. He grabbed a kid, I grabbed a kid. I lost mine when she went. Laurie, I haven't seen him since.
At what stage did you really think it was serious? About an hour and a half before she went down.
And was there any panic getting the people up?
There was not until I got onto the decks.
And then what happened?
There was a fair few on the port side, and that was a side that they shouldn't have been on, because they couldn't lower new life rafts through it.
Wellington should have been the only region to see these images that night, but they were viewed in the South Island. A Christchurch cameraman drove to the foot of the Southern Alps where Wellington's signal could be received. He pointed his camera at a TV set, recorded the bulletin, and raced back to Christchurch where his film was put to air that night. The NZBC's Wahine coverage later won an International News Award.
The Wellington Police appealed a short time ago for survivors of the Wahine who have not already contacted the police to do so immediately to enable their names to be checked with the passenger list.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Parts of the country waited a day to see the Wahine footage, but in 1969, a new era dawned. Network links allowed us all to see Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. We did have to wait for the Air Force to fly the tapes over from Australia, and the fledgling network required plenty of improvisation. But finally, we shared our news. And in 1971, there was a similar breakthrough for international news when the Warkworth satellite station was opened. Now, stories from the other side of the world were no longer an international flight away.
Satellites have changed fundamentally news coverage around the world. It's been the biggest single technological breakthrough that has so transformed our news coverage. The time delays in our coverage of the Vietnam War ranged between 3 to 4 days in terms of film footage, but we were receiving reasonably up-to-date wire copy coming through of what was happening. It led to the bizarre situation which we were all used to, and the audience was quite, I think, comfortable with, because there was no alternative, that we'd write an introduction to a story saying the Tet Offensive has entered day 4 and pressure is building at Da Nang, or whatever the story was. We'd update what had happened that day, and then we'd say, meanwhile, 4 days ago in Saigon, and it would be just a way to get into the track. And the track inevitably consisted of an American journalist reporting for CBS News, and there we were watching it 4 days late.
Warkworth didn't change that situation overnight. At first, its use was limited to special events because the post office charges were deemed too expensive. But by 1985, satellites were available 24 hours a day. We had access to international footage on demand. And there was no clearer illustration of this than the 1991 Gulf War.
If the Vietnam War was like a war we watched on a 4-day delay basis, the Gulf War was the one we watched live. And that does absolutely provide the example of the contrast. Because the day that the opening shots rang out in the Gulf, we went immediately live, and we stayed live. We stayed live for hours.
In 1989, we took another step closer to the rest of the world when we sent journalists Susan Wood to Australia and Liam Giori to Europe as foreign correspondents.
I wasn't the first New Zealander to report from that part of the world, but I was the first New Zealander to report from there in a consistent manner, almost daily. As a foreign correspondent, I was there to reflect matters of interest to New Zealand and Europe and that part of the world. So naturally, I was off following a matter of great interest to New Zealanders, which was the Kiwi Rugby League forthcoming test against Great Britain. And I was up north, but I was also watching the news, and I could sort of see that this incredible thing was starting to happen in Germany, and so the word went around all the journalistic community like, the wall's going to fall, they can't, you know, the East Germans can't hold it, the wall's going to fall, the wall's going to fall. So I remember making a telephone call back to TVNZ, to the editor, and saying, look, I've got a real problem here. The Berlin Wall's about to fall and the world's about to change as we know it. But on the other hand, you know, it is the third and deciding test. Sports editor says, well, obviously you've got to do the test. News editor says, obviously you've got to go to Berlin, and Berlin won.
The late 60s and early 70s saw our television journalists and interviewers beginning to assert their independence. In earlier years, it had been expected that television would simply accept the status quo. Now, a new breed of journalists were challenging that assumption, and they were coming into conflict with politicians who thought because they own television, they should control it.
They believed that television was their territory and we should operate according to their rules. And indeed, that's how it worked. I remember seeing Keith Holyoake, the then Prime Minister, arriving at the studios in Waring Taylor Street. And when he came to be interviewed, everybody trembled, of course. And the entire management would line up like, you know, as if you were meeting the Queen, and would all shake hands. Everybody would be there from the Director General down. And then the interviewer would hand the Prime Minister his questions. And Keith would go, yes, no, and just stroke out the ones he didn't want to answer, hand them back. He'd go into the studio would have a fan positioned for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister would say he didn't want the camera there, that wasn't a very good profile. So Keith, as he later became, used to use a lip salve. And woe betide any director who showed him using this lip salve because he had dry lips during the interview. That's what it was like.
He was very clever. Very much, as some people remember anyway, the old style of rather plummy-voiced, sonorous, reassuring, don't worry, I know about everything, I am your Prime Minister.
I am not aware of any increased, I'm simply not aware.
The new style of current affairs arrived with the first episode of Compass in 1964.
People loved it. That was the beauty of it. New Zealanders said, great, this is our country, this is our television system, this is our way of life. And here we are exploring and finding out about it through TV. A most amazing, terrific feeling. We had to borrow cameras from the National Film Unit, and they had huge, ancient, old cast-iron light stands that you had to trundle into people's houses and bang them off the walls and shift all the chairs around and blow the fuses when you put the lights on. And the cameras had chattery magazines. It was all film. And so you'd take off your coat and put all the coats over the magazine of the camera to try and keep it reasonably quiet. And lean forward to your subject who'd never done a television interview before, and I'd only done about 3 anyway, and go bang with the clapperboard and then say, now, would you mind telling me about so-and-so? And off we'd go.
Journalists were now asking harder questions, but this new independence didn't please everyone. There were still those who didn't want their views challenged. Minister of Defence Alan McCready was one of them.
In the early 70s, we were putting to air television coverage which was starting to throw serious doubts that America and its allies, New Zealand amongst them, was going to win the Vietnam War. And increasingly the stories that were coming out were ones of defeats and problems. And so it was against that environment that Mr. McCready was taken to Vietnam, I think probably at the invitation of the Americans, and escorted around and shown what they thought was appropriate, and came back here. Whereupon he took on the politically appointed board and said, your news service is not telling the truth. I've seen what's happening and we are winning the Vietnam War. And so they in turn instructed the Director General, who instructed the newsroom, to put Mr. McCready on the news, unedited, unchallenged, but to present the other side of the news, the side that he believed was accurate. The journalists rebelled and said, no, that's political interference, cut and dry, there's no way we will let that news go to air in that way. And so the politicians and the board were still adamant. So what they did was they put him on immediately after the news. And basically his message was say, don't trust what the news is saying. Here I, a politician who've been flown to Vietnam, can tell you that we're winning the war.
And that's the Network News for Tuesday, the 5th of May.
I think that's what people are wanting this time. They're sick of promises.
In the 70s and 80s, the relationship between politicians and television would be dictated by one man. Rob Muldoon went on the attack on camera.
We were all terrified of him. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And I suppose until Simon Walker came along with his famous interview about Russian ships, no one had really taken him on.
Prime Minister, it's customary in an interview for the interviewer to ask questions and for them to be answered singly.
I'm not much interested in what's customary. This is a very important matter for New Zealand.
I agree,
I want you to help me to clarify the issue.
Prime Minister, I would like to ask individual questions,
yes,
and I would be grateful if you would answer them on an individual basis.
Well, of course I will, but you're not going to set the rules, my friend. This is an important matter, and we're going to get to the truth of it.
For more than a decade, Muldoon did his best to dominate the medium. He had his own unique style, and interviewers found it a difficult one to combat.
I will not have some smart aleck interviewer changing the rules of the game halfway through, Mr. Walker.
The difficulty with Rob Muldoon was what happened before the interview. Normally, you'll chat to someone you're going to interview, and they'll chat back to you. He had no small talk at all. And I often thought that he was psyching you out.
And I remember the normal pattern would be, you know, you'd get to him, thank you, Prime Minister, we're all set to go, and yes, all right, make up, da-da-da, you've done all that. And off you'd go and put, I have to say, not as confidently as I ever wanted, the first question. And Muldoon would then, you remember he had that little thing on the side of his face, you put the question, and Muldoon would go, which meant message received. And then he'd go, and which meant stand by for the answer. And then he'd say, that was a very silly question. And go,
if you don't want it that way, go the other way.
Brian Edwards quickly emerged as one of the stars of the new school of television interviewers, and his on-air mediation of a postal workers' strike was a substantial feather in his cap. But viewers weren't always sure about the Edwards approach. And when he went head-to-head with heart surgeon Christian Barnard, there were howls of outrage.
There was this sense that the man was a guest in the country. But not only that, he was a very famous surgeon. He was a doctor. For heaven's sake, you don't criticize doctors. And he also had this quite romantic mystique about him. And here he was being cross-examined by this prat, Brian Edwards. And actually, he gave as good as he got.
You changed from the dedicated surgeon, Professor Barnard, to Chris Barnard, international playboy.
Have you ever heard that they've been able to say that I'm a bad doctor, that I'm a bad surgeon, that I've neglected my work?
I've never heard that.
Well, I mean, so if one can be, as you say, a playboy and a good doctor, why not be both then?
You completely throw me. Are you accepting this definition, playboy?
Well, it depends on what your definition of playboy. I mean, a man who enjoys life, is that a playboy? I think we would all like to enjoy life.
He was, really absolutely marvellous in that interview, and he didn't mind at all. People were outraged. And then what happened was there was a backlash. First of all, you had hundreds of people writing to the newspapers saying, send Edwards home. And then gradually, people started to write and say, this is what we want. This is the style of interviewing we need. We've had these sycophantic interviews for far too long. Let's have more of this. And suddenly everything changed.
15 years later, the face of current affairs was changing again. Holmes debuted in 1989 with the now legendary Dennis Conner interview, and once more viewers were divided.
Paul, and as I just said, it's not a perfect world, and we have all made some mistakes we're not proud of.
You had to remember how we had recoiled from his attitude during that press conference.
But you said at the time, Bruce Farr was a loser. You said that you were sailing against a dog. You said New Zealand, the team, was full of shit. Do you think
we recorded that interview Friday night. Monday night we played it, thinking the public would embrace us unanimously. And of course, by the end of the programme, an uproar was occurring. The country was crying out in anger from its guts.
I have to run now, so I'd like to thank you very much for having me on your show. I would like to wish you luck in the future, and sure look forward to being down here with the New Zealand people and their upcoming fabulous event. Thank you very much for having me.
But would you be interested in apologising to Mr. Farr in public, Mr. Conner, for that incident that happened last year?
I mean, it's set up 50% who like Holmes, 50% who hate him. You know, that programme went to air at 6:30 on April 3rd, 1989. By April the 4th, there was no one in the country who didn't know about the Holmes programme.
Controversy aside, Holmes helped to change the way television is made in this country.
Close his mouth, I suppose. I see a lot of real informality in the way some of the younger people coming on are doing television, and I think we may have been the first to do that. We may have been instrumental in teaching a younger generation that you can show members of the public the camera's over there and people don't mind. The world doesn't fall apart. Because, you know, the public know there's a camera. They know there's a camera there and a man working the camera filming me.
You're Prime Minister today. What do you do?
Well, Paul,
because you've got a problem now, Mr. Adams.
The first thing you do is you change the whole economic and monetary policy mix of New Zealand, because
I think we contributed to the politicians and their press people becoming aware that they had to be concise. And why should they not be? A politician should be able to express in a good sentence what it is the policy's about. I think so. We all should be if we want to be convincing, not just political people.
And the richest are going to get $23.
Yeah, but the crisis is today. The crisis is next week, maybe the next couple of months. So what do you do? I mean, it's all very well talking about major policy infrastructure overhaul.
So we saw an age of conciseness develop, and the Holmes programme may have contributed to that, I think.
Asia's got nothing to do with this.
Excuse me, Paul, before you go on, just take a look at this.
What?
Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday, dear Paul.
After the break, the rise of homegrown drama and comedy.
Thank you very much. I might have known Cameron Bennett couldn't go near that outfit without coming up with that, and look at the candles, and gosh, there aren't very many of them, are there? Nice before I go to see the interest rates coming down at all the banks. Nearly all the banks. All you're looking at is the candles, isn't it? Look.
Different faces
many races living in the sun. Good times to remember, where all may live as one. Living in a time where things are changing every day. Living in a place where each is free to go his way.
By the early 70s, we had decided we wanted to see ourselves on TV as we really were, not as British colonials, but as Kiwis. Commercials started to show real New Zealanders, and television drama followed suit with a groundbreaking new series. Pukimanu arrived, and we loved it.
Look, we're here to talk about the future of Pukimanu, not to just keep wrangling with each other and arguing with each other.
The impact of Pukimanu was like if you dropped a very large bomb somewhere in Willis Street. All over the country, people watched Pukimanu. I couldn't go into a bar anywhere that I went to without people saying, hey, aren't you that guy off Pukimanu? And then they'd want to talk about the stories and the characters.
I'm sorry to drag you out like this.
Pukimanu caught the mood of the times in a way that previous productions hadn't. One of the first serious attempts at local drama had been an adaptation of Bruce Mason's play The Evening Paper in 1965. But its bitter view of suburban life was unpopular with viewers still coming to terms with seeing local stories on their screens.
You go and make your wife a nice cup of tea. Go on, you lazy Bruce.
Well, we didn't like being criticised, and basically there was a sort of, it was like a tourist board mentality that really if we were going to show New Zealand anyway, it should be, we're very nice, and why don't we use the scenery more? You know, he'd write a play, but where is our lovely, lovely scenery? You know, this was considered a grave omission. And Bruce Mason copped it most with a play called The Evening Paper.
Well, I've had my cup of tea and I'll sit on the sea and I can't get it. You leave it alone.
It was an interesting play, but the characters weren't particularly appealing and they weren't nice. And the next day, the phones were red hot, and Bruce received a letter saying, you have besmirched the fair name of this country.
True. There's more to life than standing on a mountain top yelling into a wind.
The rest of the 60s was largely spent learning how to make television drama, and by 1971, a core group of actors, producers, directors and writers had come to grips with the new medium. And when they were allowed to put their skills to work, the result was Pukimanu.
It had a rural setting, it was, you know, the timber town, and people thought, this is something about us, and they recognised the characters. Each episode had a good story, great team of actors, a great team of writers. I did one episode in the second series and felt very privileged to do that.
Pukimanu was so well received that an unprecedented second series was demanded, and it opened the door for our first true soap opera. On May the 8th, 1975, Close to Home debuted.
My then first controller, a guy called Bill Morris, said, OK, Michael, you're doing the drama stuff. I want you to do a soapy. I want 5 programmes a week. My face falls about 5 programmes a week. With NZBC, maybe 5 a year. So we think this is in a pretty tall order. We talked him down. He said, OK, Alex, I'll take 2 a week just for a start. So we looked at Coronation Street and said, what worked? And we said, OK, A Family works. We wanted to make them a little bit different. So we actually made them of Yugoslavian extraction, and the family was doing the everyday thing in New Zealand, like middle class, if that's possible, in the way, and of course it had a pub, because a pub is where people meet.
I'll take bag number 18, thanks, Selwyn.
The curtain didn't come down on Close to Home until 1983, 818 episodes later. The soap opera might have lacked the edge of Pukimanu, but it still had a dedicated following.
But the bottom line is what it did, it connected drama to the New Zealand public, and they saw themselves on screen and they were very excited. It was wonderful.
Television drama made the headlines again in 1977, but not entirely for the right reasons. The Governor was our most ambitious undertaking to date, but the historical epic presented a picture of good Governor Grey that was very different from the way he was portrayed in school textbooks. And the cost of the series drew heavy criticism from the government, which launched an inquiry into its $1.4 million budget.
The whole Governor furore was a storm in a political teacup. It had nothing to do with television. The furore had nothing to do with television. The politicians of the day saw a red rag, and it was the first time they'd ever seen 6 noughts and a 1 with a dollar sign in front of it associated to a television program. And they took it as an opportunity, or the government of the day, which was Mr. Muldoon's government, took it as an opportunity to lambast television for profligacy.
I'm going to join my chief, Rauri. He's built a road up to his pass so that your soldiers won't be too tired to fight.
You really think you'll be better off with the bravado of this madman Rauri than here, serving the governor of New Zealand?
And in 1998, we returned to our 19th century past with the series Greenstone.
We are honored.
Other chapters of our history were visited. In 1983 came the groundbreaking and critically acclaimed Pioneer Women. And the 80s also saw our first cop drama. Mortimer's Patch focused on a small-town police station.
Okay, Bob.
All said, Mort. For God's sake, do you know who works in there?
Who?
Debbie Pollock.
Talk to her?
She didn't even see me.
In later productions like Shark in the Park and Plainclothes, the police were transferred to the Big Smoke. But more recently, Duggan has revisited the patch of the small-town cop.
It was him.
How do you know? Because he told me it's all fixed.
If you must have connections with prostitutes, wear some protection.
Prime Minister, Mrs. Woods, what's happening? Can you tell us?
There will be an election in 4 weeks' time. It'll be our lot against the other lot.
Give us a yell when we're boiling.
Oh, no, she's got a cop.
Is that so bad?
The cop takes coffee and barrister's bordello. She'll have us on the mat before you can blow your nose. Where's that Joe bloody Donovan?
In New Zealand's television history, the chapter on comedy in the 60s is a short one. The first real signs of life didn't come until Buck House in 1974.
So that was written by Joe Musaphia and me, and we enjoyed writing together. Spent a lot of time lying on the floor laughing, probably more than the viewers in the long term. But it was set in another recognisable situation, you know, young people in a flat. There was a neighbour, and they got up to all sorts of things.
The second series of Buck House starred John Clark. 12 months earlier, on the final episode of Gallery for 1973, he had unleashed one of this country's finest comedic creations. We met Fred Dagg for the first time, and it was love at first sight.
What the hell's daylight saving, mate?
Dagg was a tie-happy farmer who wasn't scared to share his opinions. They were, of course, always bloody good ones. John Clark's dry sense of humour and steady supply of catchphrases made Fred Dagg irresistible and unforgettable.
We had 48,000 people.
48,000?
Yeah, last Saturday, 48,000 people at a political meeting in New Zealand. Virtually unheard of.
Where was this?
At Athletic Park. There was actually a football match played at the meeting, just to keep everybody amused. As a matter of fact, some of my more complex policies I don't think were fully understood by the voters.
John Clark has always been a genius. John and Michael were great mates, our great mates, my brother who wrote the Lynn of Tower scripts. And John, again, you see, what John does, even to this day, is make humour look simple, make himself less than the sum of his parts.
Any slogans?
Slogans are a bit of a bother, I agree. Some of the members of our caucus are not very bright. They're not coming up with the sort of slogans we're interested in. The one we've got at the moment is it's time for a beer, which we're particularly pleased with, because indeed it is. Keep New Zealand daggish.
In 4 short years, Fred Dagg became a star of screen, stage and recording studio, and then he was gone. John Clark moved to Australia.
More seriously, John, why did you leave New Zealand in the first place?
Well, because it was there, Kevin.
You had to leave it to come over here.
It was necessary to leave the one in order to arrive in the other.
In 1979, Jeanette MacDonald introduced us to another of New Zealand comedy's great characters. Lynn of Tawa was created by Jeanette with her brother Michael.
Well, she first came about because I was doing a downstage theatre review when I was 16, and Bruce Mason encouraged me, and Bruce said that I had a flair with accents and should exploit. And he said, think of a character. So I said, her name's Lynn, she chews gum and she comes from Tawa. I didn't really know where Tawa was, but I knew there were all these satellite suburbs of Wellington, Taita, Tawa, Nainai, Wainui, and people would ring the talk back and say, it's Brenda of Wainui here. It was always of, never from.
I'm not Tune O'Neill, I'll play. You know, some people say I look a bit like her. No, I'm Lynn. Hello.
Lynn was as urban as Fred was rural. She was another authentic Kiwi. The good people of Tawa never quite took Lynn to their collective bosom, but the rest of the country hung on her every upward inflection, and even the Queen wasn't safe from her.
Working? Good evening, Your Majesty. Hello, Mum. You know who's up there, eh? Your Majesty, my name is Lynn, and I come from a little place called Tawa. Oh, we were the ones who sent you the power shell tiara for a wedding present. You know, the one with the 2 rampant Kiwis holding the word progress between their beaks? And the matching cruet set? Do you remember that? Thought you might, eh?
I wasn't supposed to be in that concert. I was deemed too non-you. They were going to have a female impersonator called Diamond Lil.
Oh, yeah.
I was not allowed to be in the concert, but he got the flu or something, so I was a ring-in at the last minute. Again, Michael wrote the script and dictated it down the phone. I remember it was very long, and it was, and at the end I had to say,
We all love you, eh? Ta-da.
The Queen, when we met her afterwards, we had to curtsy. She looked quite glazed, as if she wasn't there anyway. She was floating transcendentally off. I don't think she'd taken a word in.
More classic Kiwi characters emerged from the pens and performances of Christchurch satirists David McPhail and John Gadsby.
I think principally because we were, in fact, at that stage doing a number of things that had not been done before and as frequently on television. The other thing, I think, was that shows sometimes come of age because of circumstances, or a show will arrive because of the environment of the country or whatever. We were involved in political satire at a time when the political scene was quite, in some upheaval, led by a certain politician who rose to eminence.
And it's McPhail's mastery of that certain politician that we remember so well.
Well, I got a little joke. And look at the waste. Look, 3 cameras when one could be doing the job. You're fired. Look at all the lights. They don't know there's an energy crisis in television. Turn them off. All right, who's the smart aleck? Let there be light. And there was light.
I always thought I bore just a very slight resemblance to him. Completely slight. No, what in fact happened was that when it was first suggested that we do that, I was the only one who was the right size, if you like. We tried it with a lot of makeup, and it took such a long time to do that, in fact, the idea of doing them was scrapped because it was just time-consuming. You know, it took about half an hour to put all the stuff on. Until one day when we did really want to do him quickly because there was something that had been done, and I said, let's just slick my hair back and stick a few lines on and we'll just see what happens. And it did happen, and it got the message across, and the joke was made.
McPhail and Gadsby changed comedy. because having referred earlier to the timidity, they flouted all those things, and people realised that people loved seeing their politicians made fun of.
In the late 80s, MacPhail and Gadsby branched out, using one of their friends as the inspiration for a sitcom.
It was simply that I have a fishing batch down at the Rangitata, and sharing that area is a very old friend of mine, John Blanchfield, who's known as Blanchy. And we were down there with John Gadsby and A.K. Grant and myself, the three writers of the show. And we wanted to put out a flounder net, and I didn't have one, and so he pinched one of Blanchy's, telling him that we'd cut him in on the flounders. But by way of a joke, we decided to write him a letter on the assumption that the net had been damaged.
In fact, they went on to say that just about all of Blanchy's property had been destroyed. And it was from that Letter to Blanchy was born. The series featured a parade of characters most New Zealanders could identify with. And there were more familiar Kiwi faces in the hapless civil servants of Gliding On.
Well, I suppose Jim is the one that people did like. He was the Kiwi Archie Bunker. He was both awful, but you couldn't help but like him, really. We all knew a Jim.
But there'll be free booze, won't there?
There'd be people like Beryl, and they also liked Beryl's mum, which was interesting because she never actually appeared. But poor old Beryl, when the phone goes and she picked it up and said, "Hello, Mum,"
Hello, Mum.
which told us no one else ever phoned her.
Yes, I've been back. Well, they're fixing Jim's electric blanket in the boss's iron.
A distinctive Māori sense of humour had been bubbling under the surface for decades without ever finding a true outlet. Billy T. James finally gave it full expression. But when he first appeared, it was in a very different guise, as the urbane Dexter Fitzgibbon in Radio Times.
Mama don't allow no piano playing around here. I said, Mama don't allow no piano playing around here. No, sir. Well, Crosby don't care what Mama don't allow. He gonna play that damn piano anyhow. Mama don't allow no piano playing around here. Play that.
And Billy at that stage had really started to develop, you know, into just one of the great comics of New Zealand. And he had such... And his comedic skills had overridden his beautiful voice and his really great guitar skills. He was such a great musician, old Billy. He's fantastic.
When I give him my back, I pinched it.
Billy T again. Sometimes he'd do that Maori thing, but behind it was all this discipline and experience, and that's what I really admire, and that's what the public actually respond to.
A kaukoki in Te Ao Mutu was fined $50 for not reporting the theft of his neighbour's gate. He said, I saw these two fellas pinching the gate, but I never said anything in case they took offence.
Who was that person on their deathbed? Some American comic said, dying is easy, comedy is hard.
That was quick. It was good, but it was quick. Hang on a minute. That can't be... Oh, no, it's a commercial break.
In 1973, television was still black and white, but the Commonwealth Games were coming up in Christchurch, and we didn't want the rest of the world to think we were backward. Out went the old Pi and Ultimate sets, and in came the new Philips K9 colour tellies. At last, television could show us the world as it really looked. The Games were the catalyst for colour, and the new dimension in our TV viewing was quickly apparent.
They're carrying white shoulder bags and wearing white shoes. Good, mod, chunky heel styling on those shoes too. That's the New Zealand team.
From the first night of colour TV, even the clothes worn by our presenters took on a new importance.
I had a slightly mauve, I still have it, sort of mauvey background frock with bits of colour on it. And I know that in Wellington, our senior people were somewhere ready to watch this great, momentous occasion of colour being switched on throughout New Zealand. And when I came up on camera, apparently, and there I was in all my colourful glory, as it were, they all went, hooray, and clapped and shouted and screamed, but then I didn't know that, did I?
No.
I was just doing my usual programme summary. Then at 25 to 10, we explore the world of New Zealand wildlife photographer Jeff Moon as he records in film the life of our threatened native birds. At 10:05, we have a story called Gun in the Pulpit, and it shows us how a man acquitted of murder starts a new life in a different town.
And colour brought new challenges for television's cooks.
Colour television just made the food look, it made it jump out of the screen at you. You know, black and white food is boring compared with colour food. And I can remember a program being made saying what a wide range of filled rolls was on sale and how some of them were much better than others. And the people who were presenting it had real problems because they couldn't make the scungy ones look scungy.
But it was the 1974 Commonwealth Games that really launched the era of colour television in this country, even if the transformation wasn't quite complete.
The games in 1974 weren't completely in colour. We simply didn't have enough television units for outside broadcast to cover every event that was on each day in colour. I think one of the very first times in world coverage, cameras went back behind the weightlifting podium, and you could see the weightlifters in the dressing rooms being psyched up, doing their practice lifts, taking the sniffing salts and smelling salts, being punched and urged on by their trainers, and that was a real breakthrough for television.
The 74 Games were a massive undertaking for New Zealand television. 5 years earlier, a production on this scale would have been unthinkable. But today, it's the sort of spectacle that we've almost come to take for granted. Even the British were impressed with our colour. They sent technicians over here to find out how we created such bright images. In the end, they put it down to our relatively unpolluted skies. But not all sports had welcomed the television cameras. Rugby was the country's leading code, and the public had been expecting live coverage almost as soon as TV began here.
The rugby union in the early days was very suspicious of television. They thought television was an ogre to be scorned and not allowed in to the grounds, because they believed that if television came in, people would stay at home and watch the games in their living rooms and not go to the grounds.
Going, gone.
And there may have been another reason for rugby's distrust of the cameras.
I attended a meeting at Eden Park with the late Tom Pearce, who's the chairman of the Auckland Rugby Union. And Tom trotted out the idea that he was not keen at all on the television cameras showing the inside of the scrummage. So he insisted that we were not to show close-ups of scrum work, because he feared that the knuckle that happened in scrums might disillusion the public about what went on in rugby matches.
Then they allowed some secondary school matches to be telecast live, and that was in 1967. And then it wasn't until in the 70s that full live telecast games came into the New Zealand rugby relationship with the rugby union and TV.
Well, good afternoon, everybody from Eden Park. We're sorry about the loss of sound. Hope you can hear us now. Welcome from Eden Park for the first live test telecast screened by the NZBC network. A historic occasion indeed, and the Northern Television cameras and technicians are ready to go.
To Morris, 2 against 1, Williams. Drives straight at McGill.
Hayden beats Moolman that time. That's Stockberg looking for support. He's got it from Eddie Becker, just 10 metres out. Down and up, the referee was involved. It's back for the drop kick from Borta. And that's the first points on the board, and Borta has done it again. Nas Borta puts the Springboks into the early lead.
More problems lay ahead in 1981 when the Springbok Tour divided the country. Major games went live to South Africa, and for many in television, it was a very uncomfortable time.
That's a try and a brilliant one.
I was involved in broadcasting the games, and I told the bosses of TV New Zealand that I would broadcast the rugby games, but I didn't want to be involved in any discussions about the rights and wrongs of the tour, because privately I was against the tour. When we'd gone around the lead-up games of what was a very tough event to cover from town to town, we got to Eden Park, and there was a man flying over the top with a plane that was dropping in behind the TV commentary box, and I could see it going lower than the level of the commentary box at the top of the Eden Park grandstand. And out in the streets there were people fighting and throwing things to policemen who had batons up and shields, and there were those big bins around to keep the people out, and there was anger and demonstrations inside the ground. And that was an awful game to cover and to be involved with.
The 1990 Commonwealth Games in Auckland produced much happier television images. They were another massive undertaking, and a mixture of state-of-the-art and the chewing gum and string improvisation that has been so much a part of the story of television in this country. The Games called for 13 outside broadcast vans, but there were only 9, so the other 4 were created out of old transport containers.
Gary Anderson cycling for gold. Gary Anderson, magnificent ride, and New Zealand has gold at the velodrome.
And our television coverage came of age in another way. 20 years earlier, we'd been forced to rely on Australia's pictures of the 1968 Olympics. There was little to be seen of our athletes, but much was made of the Aussie successes. Now in 1990, the British press were complaining about the New Zealand commentators, accusing them of rabbiting on about the home country's brave boys and girls and precious little else.
She's over. The New Zealander is in the lead again. Dramatic jump off. Silver for Janet Boyle. Gold for 19-year-old Tanya Murray.
Earlier this year, the string and chewing gum were left under the seat as innovation became the byword in the coverage of the 2000 America's Cup.
The first time in 149 years of competition for yachting's holy grail, the America's Cup is still New Zealand's Cup.
But it's not just the big events that have pitted us against each other on television. On quiz shows, we've competed for our towns, our pets, our personal pride, our schools, and the possibility of winning our very own feather duster. It's in the Bag was already a national institution when it finally made its television debut in 1973, but the proven radio formula had an extra element. Selwyn Toogood was given an assistant.
My pleasure now to introduce Heather Eggleton, ladies and gentlemen.
Selwyn was a master of the dramatic and the humour and the theatre of it, and we played that together. Nothing was rehearsed, nothing at all, and of course we never knew what was in the bags at any time. Well, I never did anyway, and I was the one that had to pull them out. I never knew which bag what was in what.
What is your name? Oh!
Aileen Walker.
Aileen, which bag would you like?
2, please.
Bag number 2 has gone, I'm afraid.
Oh, 8.
Bag number 8, is bag number 8 there, Heather?
Yes.
I'll offer you $100, the money or the bag. Now, it's been running from the competitors tonight except for that last one. $100, the money or the bag. At $100, what should she do, customers?
No, I'll take the money.
You're taking the money at $100. Heather, tell us what is in the bag, please.
The Atlas Americana cooker with the thermo wave.
Oh, you wouldn't listen.
But you've got $100. Do you feel happy about that?
Oh, I feel lovely.
Well, I'll make it $198. Now, will you take the money or the bag at $198?
I'll take the bag.
You'll take the bag. Now, I would like to hear
And Selwyn had a wonderful way of working with people. He could cut a contestant or a person off at the knees if they were show-offy or blow-hard or thought they were somebodies. But the ordinary, compassionate, real, honest New Zealander of the time, the Kiwi, he loved them. And he milked that for everything there was. So he made them feel good, made the audience that was there feel wonderful, a part of the show. They were a part of it. And of course, it was translated through to living rooms.
$98. The money or the bag at $198, Anne?
I'll take the bag.
We come now to the moment of truth. Old Mac is underneath the chair up there. Would you please tell me, Heather, and let's have a look at Heather's face, it will tell. Oh, it doesn't look too hopeful. Doesn't look too promising, Anne McMillan.
I'd like to read it to Mr. McMillan. It's the Pi 26-inch console colour television.
Kevin Milne from Fair Go. I think we've met before, haven't we? Is this Agatron Farms project just another one of your cons, is it?
Well, I think Karen, don't shout, just relax.
Most shows on New Zealand television have come and gone, but a few have stayed. One of them, from 1977, tells the stories of everyday New Zealanders trying to get a fair go.
I think Fair Go worked so well because it was a goodies and baddies show. It was cowboys and Indians, really, cops and robbers, and New Zealanders loved that sort of show. And you saw the baddies getting their comeuppance.
People also, I think, like confrontation. They love to see the little man and the big man, or the Fair Go reporter running down the road after this crook heading off down the road. They love that. We deal with problems that people can get to grips with. We don't deal with the wine box inquiry, for example, but we deal with somebody whose car breaks down. And so most of the problems that we deal with, people can sort of have either experienced themselves or they can understand how they would feel if it were happening to them.
Faces have changed, the pace has picked up, and the studio audience has gone. But today, Fair Go is still the same show that Brian Edwards helped to devise 23 years ago.
Interesting about Fair Go is that there had been nothing like it before, and it made the executives rather nervous because before Fair Go you weren't even allowed to mention the name of a product. Here suddenly was a program where you were not only naming products and naming people, but you were saying they were villains. And that caused a few butterflies in people's stomachs at the beginning.
Well, now, if we knew the names, they went to air. And so we used to have our lawyers on the phone available to us all week, and on the day of the program they would come out to Avalon and be with us all day. And they would go through the whole scripts and everything like that. We even used to have lawyers on the show to give the Fair Go a certain gravitas. You know, we have lawyers here. Nowadays, of course, we avoid them to give us more credibility.
New Zealand needs my husband.
Like we need mad cow disease.
Thank you very much for coming along, first of all, and thank you for watching.
Almost from day one on television, we embraced shows about food. Graham Kerr led the way. In 1962, the former Air Force catering officer made Entertaining with Care, offering as much entertainment as cooking advice.
It's really rather nice. Beautiful scrambled eggs. Right, does that answer the problem? Can I get back in my chair again?
Graham Kerr was flamboyant, he was a real showman, he made exciting things, but people growled because they didn't want to make those things themselves.
Right. And so television looked for someone who could demonstrate everyday food for everyday people.
my program started to be a contrast to Graham Care's.
There are so many interesting and beautiful vegetables around now in the colder weather. There's no excuse for you not to be cooking interesting and beautiful vegetable recipes.
We alternated because he would have 6 programs on 6 Friday nights or whatever it was, and then he'd have a gap for 6 weeks and I would have 6 programs, and then it would go on. But he left New Zealand and went off to Australia, and that left me.
Alison Holst became our trusted friend in the kitchen, introducing us to exotic foods like garlic and soy sauce. But her calm, level-headed approach sometimes disguised a state of chaos in the studio.
Now, didn't your kitchen catch on fire once as well?
It did. And I was so well trained. It was quite a long kitchen, that we had different kitchens. They kept planning new ones. And they'd always said, you mustn't stop, you mustn't stop. And I was working in the middle, and a fire started at one end. So I thought, OK, well, I'll just walk along towards the other end and do the things there, and then somebody will be able to creep into the kitchen and just put the fire out at the other side. But they didn't. The fire got too big, so they had to actually stop the show and start again.
If Alison Holst and Graham Care were at opposite ends of the cooking spectrum, Hudson and Halls were from another planet altogether. From 1977 until 1984, their shows were barely contained chaos as they laughed, squabbled and tippled their way through their recipes.
Right, now I get you, I'm on now. Well, I can't.
As we've continued our love affair with on-screen food, we've also developed an insatiable appetite for other information and lifestyle programs. They've been with us since the beginning, but they've really come into their own in the last 15 years. We've shared our knowledge of gardening, building and designing, and celebrated the Kiwi way of life.
In the past, we haven't been great talkers. In the past, we haven't been, you know, the good old New Zealand character doesn't sort of sit down and bleed their whole heart out to you. We've changed a lot. We've got views now. We've got attitudes now. And so being able to celebrate what we do, talk about what we do, have opinions about what we do. New Zealanders are much more open about doing that now. And that's enabled us to do a whole lot of different styles of programming. That's allowed us to do more the lifestyle, for people to be able to celebrate who and what they are, an environment they enjoy.
When I was 15.
We've got to make sure that there is also the investigative documentaries, that there's also strands of documentaries, so that we are able to question, to evaluate, to be able to give an understanding who we are. And I think that that comes from a great cross-section of programming.
While information and lifestyle programs have helped us to live our lives, documentaries have told us about ourselves. In the early 60s, Shirley Maddock was a pioneer at a time when there weren't many documentaries being made in New Zealand.
Well, they were nearly all imported, mostly from the BBC, of course. And, you know, people got very used to seeing turtles laying eggs in the Galapagos Islands, and sometimes rather sexy nature film documentaries. There used to be a man from Mount Eden who would ring up and complain about, you know, grasshoppers copulating. And we knew the following week it was going to be elephants, so we're not quite sure how he coped with that.
In 1964, Shirley produced one of the first local documentary series with her award-winning Islands of the Gulf.
Well, it was received with enormous enthusiasm, in fact, much more so than people, they thought perhaps only Aucklanders would like it. But it was very popular. I think they played it about 3 times in all before it was finally stowed away in the old oak chest.
Documentary making reached new heights in 1981 with the epic Landmarks series. 3 years in the making, it explored New Zealand's development. In 1998, we returned to our past for another epic series, The New Zealand Wars. It's been through documentaries that we've examined just about every aspect of our lives.
People of Our Century, I think, brings the best out in terms of classic documentary making, because now history is not presented by an experts or by the historians. It's presented through the technology that we've got and through people who can now still touch into 1905 through the experiences of those people. I have this view, you know, there's the English style of documentary making, which is very much the authored, authoritative view, and there's a New Zealand style, which is very much getting to understand and know the people, or very observational. Documentaries now are not just for the elite audience. There are some that a more significant elitist audience would appreciate. But we've also gone, let's give documentary and documentary interest to a wider audience. It's just the way in terms of how we approach it and the stories we tell. And now you're finding that an audience that would never have watched a documentary before are watching them.
And as TV has allowed us to see ourselves, it's also let us take a good hard look at those who present the programs.
Fame is a funny old thing. There are upsides and there are big downsides. The upside is that people are pleased to see you, so you can go through the whole week and think the whole world is pleased to see you. And you do the audience surveys and you find out that 50% of people hate your guts. Well, you haven't met any of that 50% during the week. So 50% of them are probably fibbing you.
I think the first year I was on television, I got invited to 32 weddings of people I'd never met in my life before. Particularly Southlanders. I had a love affair with Southland. They were great.
We were doing the Montana Sunday Theatre of Dead Certs. I was playing a 57-year-old bag lady. I was padded, not that I needed to be, but I was padded. I had string tied around an old coat, several layers of clothing, white face makeup, eyebrows drawn up here, smeared lipstick and a terrible hat. And I was pushing a trolley filled with rubbish in Otara Market on a Saturday morning. And the number of people that said, "Hey, there's Lynn of Tawa." I thought, what do you have to do?
That's a good story.
Extraordinary.
I'm starving. Hey, you leave my guy alone with those filthy bloody hands. Jeez, Martha. Shut up, buddy.
One of the really good things about New Zealand is that we don't take anybody terribly seriously, and I mean, I think that applies across the board. You know, politicians are never over-revered, in my view, in this country. Kiwis have a good, healthy scepticism about them and about what I was or am, which is a joker on the telly.
Ah, yes. You better watch out, Jim. I can pop up anywhere.
And you get occasions like, and this has happened to me, I was walking along Lambton Quay and a fella comes up to me and says, "Geez, good day, how are you? I haven't seen you on the TV for a while, how are you?" "Yeah," and you say, "Oh, very well, thanks, how are things with you?" He said, "Yeah, that's right, Mr. Fraser, I'm fair." And you go, "No, hang on, oh, shit, sorry about that. No, it isn't that, sorry, Mr. Cross." And you go, no, it's "Oh, geez, it's Johnson, isn't it? Yeah, well, yeah, what are you doing now?" You say, "Well, I'm doing a bit of freelancing." He says, "I really love that fair goal." You say, "No, I didn't actually appear. I was Crime Watch, that's the..." So eventually they get there, you know, they identify you as somebody who is familiar to them and who is known, and with whom, which I love, they share something.
40 years ago, when TV1 began, Kiwi ingenuity played a major part in establishing New Zealand television. We went from black and white film through to colour and satellites, and now we face the digital revolution. In the 90s, multiple channels arrived, and competition became a driving force. Throughout the last 40 years, the changes in our culture have been reflected on our screens. Once, TV was a novelty to watch in a shop window. Now it's part of our lives 24 hours a day, and the style of our programs has evolved as well.
Say that New Zealand is prepared to take the benefits.
Lotus cake, 10 by the cake. Down on that one.
You know, when I started in television, programs were made by a bunch of fairly smart people for their friends. They made wonderfully intelligent, intellectual programs that nobody, frankly, could understand. We now make programs for the general population.
It is a diamond at the heart of everything in terms of communication. And it was muddied by its bureaucratic history, you know. It was working its way through that. Then it went commercial. And now somebody's saying, hang on. What should we be doing with this glass box in the living room? And I hope that we will find that balance.
Have you suddenly taken upon yourself to be spokesman for broadcasting?
Because people keep coming and asking me questions about broadcasting. Sit down!
1 Turns 40 was proudly brought to you by the New Zealand Listener. If it's worth watching, we'll tell you in The Listener.